Hey everybody! So in this video, we're going to go over the PowerPoint on SpeechSounds by Octavia Butler. This was the short story that you had to read for homework last week. So I'm going to give a real brief summary just to make sure everyone understood what was going on in the story. And then we're going to go through all of the literary elements just like we have been and talk about the themes from the story. And this story is much different than the ones that we've read so far. So I'm not sure how easy or difficult it is for others to understand. Maybe comparatively it's easier, but that doesn't mean that it's simple. Or maybe this was one that you guys read and you were like, okay, I get it. But you know, it's not exactly a world that we can identify with, because what we learn in the beginning is that there has been some sort of illness or virus that has affected the entire world, and humans have lost the ability to communicate effectively. Some people have lost their ability to speak and understand spoken language. Others have lost the ability to read and write. So our two main forms of communication are absent in each half of the population, and it leads to some pretty horrible stuff. Our main character is Rye. Her name is actually Valerie Rye. And she pretty much clues us in right in the first couple paragraphs that something's not right with this world. The whole scene on the bus, the fact that she's surprised that the bus is there in the first place. She thinks her family she has family in Pasadena. It's going to take forever, much longer to get there than it normally would. And then the two men who are having the altercation on the bus, she mentions the gestures and the grunts, So we realize pretty immediately that this is not the world we live in. And as the story progresses, we learn a little more about what's going on. We learn that Rye can still speak, but she can no longer read or write. She meets Obsidian, and they, cruise around in his car for a little while, and we learn that Obsidian can no longer speak or understand spoken language, but he can still read and write. So each of these characters has an ability to communicate, but the ability each has is lost on the other. And so they find a way to communicate in a very limited way. But what we learn from Rye, though, is that that is not the case for most people. And the inability to communicate often leads to, misunderstandings, jealousy, anger, violence, all right? But that's the world that Rye lives in. And there's a little bit of tragedy there at the end, a little bit of optimism as well. But that's essentially what this story is consisting of, is sort of a, not really post-apocalyptic, but close. Certainly it's a bit of a dystopian future. And, what happens when people lose the ability to communicate effectively. So let's get into some of those literary elements. For this story, we're going to start with setting and atmosphere, right? So the historical setting I want to talk about first. So the story was written in the 80s, early 80s. I think it was published in 1983. So, some possible influences on Butler's sort of idea here could have been certainly the Spanish flu of 1918, the pandemic that just annihilated a lot of the world population. Could have also been inspired maybe by the Cold War and the threat of nuclear attack and what would happen. What would it look like? How would people function? It could also have been, inspired by the AIDS virus, which was just becoming, sort of making headlines and people becoming aware of it during the early 80s. But certainly it's this idea of something spreading very quickly and affecting everybody. The story's actual setting, it's set in the future, but not too distant, because so many things still seem familiar. We've got buses and cars, and I mean, she doesn't give us a whole lot of specifics to know for sure what kind of time period we're talking about here, but it certainly seems, she doesn't mention anything about like flying cars or anything that would put us really far into the future. So, by making it a little more contemporary, it allows us to sense the realism in the story. Meaning, because everything is still pretty familiar to us, aside from this virus and the lack of communication, everything else seems just like our world. And that allows us to imagine the reality a little easier. Imagine that it could actually happen to us right now. Because if something's set, 2,000 years in the future, it's like, it's a cool story, it might have a really cool theme, good lessons to learn from it, but, it's still hard to relate and think that it's something that could actually happen to us, unless they do a really good job of drawing the parallels. But she doesn't have to draw the parallels in this story because it is somewhat contemporary. We know it takes place in California. We have references to Pasadena and the LAPD. We know that in this location, there's been a breakdown in society due to that illness, and most everyone has lost the ability to communicate, and chaos and violence has become the norm. Now, the atmosphere of this story is very tense, and she accomplishes that right away in the very beginning, because when Rye explains what's happening on that bus, we sense Rye's tension. We understand that there's tension between these two men. We understand that everyone else on the bus is also very tense and anxious and fearful. So Butler does a really good job of letting the tension really come through. It's also a very angry atmosphere. Nearly every character we come across experiences anger in some form. Understandably so, I would imagine. There's also this atmosphere of despair. There's anger, jealousy, fear, loneliness. They all converge, and it's just, it really is like survival mode. It's definitely not a feel-good story in the traditional sense. Let's look at the structure. Follows a pretty traditional story structure. We have our exposition. That's like the first 36 paragraphs. It's where the scene is kind of set. And that's the scene on and outside of the bus. And we learn a lot about what's happening and what kind of world they're living in those first 36 paragraphs. And again, the tension is already mounting from the first sentence. Our rising action, where the tension builds even more, it's kind of like an anti-rising action in a way. But we are getting closer to the climax, and that is paragraphs 37 through 79, and that's when, Rye and Obsidian are driving around in his car. Um, it's we're hoping that it's leading us to a positive climax. They've had sex. She has convinced him to come live with her, and we're hoping that the climax will be a pleasant one, but sadly it's not. And in paragraphs 80 through 88, the climax, of course, is when the man, the woman, and Obsidian are all killed, leaving Rye alone. It's pretty sad considering she had just decided that she could maybe be happy. And there she is, alone again. Our falling action is paragraphs 89 through 103. This is when she's kind of dealing with the aftermath, like what is she going to do? What does she do with the body? She decides she wants to bury Obsidian. And then the emotional response to everything. And then she realizes the children, the woman's children can speak. And then our kind of resolution, our denouement, is the last 7 paragraphs or so. And when Rye decides to take the children with her in order to teach them and protect them. And that's how the story ends. It's a pretty typical structure. But I think it's interesting, though, that rising action doesn't feel quite as tense or exciting as the rising action feels in a lot of other stories. And I think that's because the rising action is when the tension starts to build, right? Building towards the climax. And I think maybe this rising action feels less than because the tension has been building since the first sentence. So it's a different kind of tension that starts to build in this story's rising action. Because we've already seen some pretty uncomfortable stuff in the exposition. So it's almost like it's still an exposition and it's still rising action, but the feelings that we normally experience in each of those sections, Butler kind of flip-flops it, right? In order to make that tension really strong right away. In terms of the story's point of view, we have a limited omniscient narrator. So remember, the omniscient narrator is the kind of narrator that is not a character in the story. It's like that just all-seeing, all-knowing persona. Limited omniscient means that the narrator is the all-seeing, all-knowing type, but only for one character in the story. So in this case, of course, it's Rye. This narrator has knowledge of Rye's thoughts and feelings. It almost feels like Rye is narrating the story. But she's not. She's not speaking directly to us. She's not telling the story to us. There is, an outside narrator. But it makes sense that Rye wouldn't be the narrator, because this lack of communication that's so prevalent throughout the story, there has to be some distance between us and Rye. Because it's fitting, given how difficult it is to communicate in the story. And why is Rye the character that our narrator knows about? Well, Rye can still speak. The narrator is able to understand her, and so are we. She's also a woman, and I think, I'm not going to get into this a whole lot, although there is a whole field of study out there that looks at the feminist aspects of SpeechSounds, not only because it was written by a female author in the early 80s, which was not common for women to delve into sci-fi during that time. But also just that it's Rye, who is our main character, our protagonist in this. You know, she's sort of showing us in this futuristic, you know, dystopian world that even in our current world, sometimes it's not safe. It's not the safest choice for a woman to speak up and use her voice. But I think the main reason why it's Rye is because she still has the ability to speak. So our narrator understands her. It's interesting to think about. Our imagery, almost the entire story is imagery. We see everything Rye sees, and she tells us. The narrator, you know, allows us to see everything Rye sees. And it makes sense that the whole story practically is imagery, because communication is so limited, and she, even though she has the ability to speak, she chooses not to for the most part. So all we have is what she sees and what she feels, but you know, it's the whole thing is imagery. Everything we see through her eyes, and because nobody else is talking, so all we have is description of what is around her, description of people, description of actions. The whole thing is imagery. What we do want to focus on in this story, though, are the symbols, right? First symbol that we're going to talk about is guns. Maybe we could just categorize this as, you know, symbols of nonverbal language. But the guns in the story, they're sort of a symbol of order and peace. They are a nonverbal warning to others, right? So Rye and Obsidian they're kind of like, they're openly carrying their weapons for the most part. And it's a deterrent to others who might think about acting violently towards them, right? So it's a way to keep peace. But it's also, the guns are also a symbol of chaos and violence. You know, first of all, we know that Rye has admitted suicidal thoughts in the story. And yet, we also know that she always carries a gun. So the potential for a violent act is there. She's also acutely aware of her gun when she's sitting in the car with Obsidian and realizes that he can still read and write. You know, even though she still has the ability to speak, she, you know, was a very educated woman who, you know, she was a scholar. And so to lose her ability to read and write was just crushing. And when she realized that he can still read and write, even she experienced that moment of jealousy and anger and became very aware of her gun at her hip, because in that moment, I mean, the thought did cross her mind for a split second. That anger almost took her over. Alright, so it's, in both of those examples, it's, the gun is a symbol for the potential of violence. In our third example here, it is a tool of violence. The man uses Obsidian's gun to kill him, right? So it's no longer used to keep the peace, and instead it becomes an opportunity to allow the anger and jealousy to manifest as violence. It had the potential for Rye, but in this particular situation, with this man, the gun becomes the tool of violence. So it's an interesting non-verbal symbol in that it has the potential to be both positive and negative. Um, and it shows us that that line between order and peace and chaos and violence is tenuous at best. Um, it's a very shaky tight wire. The next symbol I want to talk about is actually Rye. Her name, I mean, first of all, in the story, we find out that she literally has a symbol of her name. She called it a name symbol. And it's a pin that looks like a stalk of wheat. Which is why she jokes, when she, the narrator clues us in, Rye's kind of jokingly thinking to herself, I'm showing Obsidian this pin, hoping that he'll guess my name is Rye. But really, he might just walk away thinking my name is Wheat. And who knows what Obsidian's real name is, right? So, it's interesting, though, that I want to talk about her as a symbol, and she literally has a name symbol that she carries with her. But think about what Rye is, okay? Rye is a grass/grain. It's very hardy and versatile and able to grow and thrive in poor conditions. Sounds like our Rye, right? It could also be a nod to Catcher in the Rye by J.D. Salinger. And if you did not have to read this book in high school, our protagonist in Catcher in the Rye is a young adolescent boy named Holden. And Holden, among other things, he has a huge distrust of adults. He thinks adults are liars, he thinks they're cheaters, he thinks they're unreliable. He just has no use for grown-ups whatsoever. And it's young kids that he thinks are, understand way more about life and how the world should work. And so he doesn't ever want to grow up. And it's not like Peter Pan syndrome, like, I just want to be a little boy and play and not have responsibilities. It's truly an adverse reaction to adulthood. But he kind of fancies himself as the protector of children. Right? I think Rye might also, at least by the end, sort of see herself as the catcher as well. So, our main character, our protagonist, Miss Valerie Rye, she is one of our symbols. She symbolizes that ability to survive against all odds, just like Rye does. Our second character, Obsidian, he is also a symbol. He also has a name symbol, right? It's the pendant of smooth, glassy black rock. And that is why Rye refers to him as Obsidian. That's what it looks like to her. Is that his real name? We will never know. But that's what she gets from that symbol, is obsidian. And obsidian is a volcanic glass. Literally comes from volcano. It's also thought to have healing properties. It's thought that it is a protective stone, right? And that it absorbs negative energy. It draws out stress and tension. It dissolves emotional blockages and ancient traumas. It promotes compassion and strength. And it helps you know who you truly are. And isn't that, all of that, isn't that exactly what obsidian becomes for Rye? You know, a protective, stone, and he's a protector. absorbs negative energy, draws out stress and tension. That's exactly what happens when they're in that car, going on that car ride together, and when they stop and they have sex in the back seat. I mean, that's exactly what she describes. She even says that, she's finally able to sort of breathe and not feel so stressed and tensed every moment. Um, he brings clarity and clears confusion. I don't know if he completely dissolved her emotional blockages and her trauma, but, certainly for the first time, she considered the possibility of happiness after having lost not only her own personal losses with communication, but losing her husband and her children, and not having anyone around. Uh, you know, she definitely had some emotional walls built, and rightfully so. And Obsidian is able to help sort of dissolve all of that, or at least start to. Right? I think Obsidian does help Rye figure out who she truly is, and I think that's why at the end she becomes the protector. She decides to take the two speaking children with her. Kind of cool how the names play a part in how we understand them. So all of that brings us to the themes. And I only need to focus on one theme, which is language or communication. So communication and isolation, communication and peace, and communication and violence. So 3 aspects of that theme. Our first aspect, communication and isolation. Without the ability to communicate, humans cannot easily form bonds with others. And we see that Rye lives a very lonely, isolated existence, one that she considers ending altogether. That having that stripped away, the ability to communicate, I can't even imagine. I don't know if I would have been as strong as her, quite honestly. I guess maybe survival instincts kick in and you just do what you gotta do. But certainly I understand her her thoughts, her suicidal thoughts. I can't imagine how just extremely soul-crushing that kind of existence is. But isn't it interesting that, we might not think about how important communication is in our ability to thrive, because we need those bonds. And maybe if we had never been born with the ability to communicate through spoken language or written language, we would have, it would have, some form of communication would have developed. But if you've gone your whole life being able to speak, being able to read and write, and then suddenly it's ripped from you, that's, how do you learn to communicate in a new way to be able to form those bonds? Because it takes others willing to do the same thing in order for it to happen. And she meets Obsidian, who's willing to try with her. And they are able to begin communicating and understanding each other. It's very basic. Who knows what that would have blossomed into had he lived? But we see that glimpse when they're in that car together, that it's not impossible. So I don't think the story is trying to tell us that without spoken language and written language were doomed. It's communication, right? But again, it takes more than one person being willing to do that, to try, to figure it out. And if you don't have that, it's very isolating, and we're not able to thrive in that type of environment. We also see the connection between communication and peace. That nonverbal language, like openly carrying a gun, it promotes peace because it's a deterrent, right? Rye's ability to begin communicating on some level with Obsidian makes her feel safe and hopeful, right? She's not at peace, but she's not fearful of violence in those moments. And then, of course, the story really shows us the connection between communication and violence. Without the ability to communicate, people are susceptible to all kinds of miscommunications. They can get jealous of each other, right? That's the main reason why Rye doesn't speak, even though she can. Because there are so many other people she could come across on a daily basis who have lost the ability to speak, and when they see it in her, they can't handle it. That loss is so profound to them. And on top of every other struggle that they now have to deal with, you know, coming face to face with someone who has what you lost, and all the other tension and stress and despair just turns violent very quickly. Without that ability to communicate, people basically turn into animals. There's no humanity left. You know, we learn in the story that those who are right-handed seem more prone to this ragey, violent reaction, this jealousy and anger. They can't handle it. Those who are left-handed, not that they're immune to the jealousy and the rage, they just seem better able to control it. You know, we see Obsidian during the whole bus thing after he takes care of it. The bus driver's, you know, yelling at him, but not with actual words. Obsidian just stands back. He doesn't interact. He doesn't engage, right? That's when Rye realizes, oh, he's probably a left-handed person, because he's able to, you know, to remain rational and calm and, you know, not let his emotions get the best of him. She is also that way. But even, like I said, we saw in the car where even she had that moment where her jealousy and anger put some thoughts in her head. Again, she's able to not act on it. But so many of the population seem unable to control it. They give into it, and they basically turn into animals. There's almost no humanity left at this point. And the hope that Rye feels at the end, once she decides to take the children with her, that hope, that optimism is completely dependent on the possibility that the virus has run its course and that language and communication might be returning. That's what her hope is. But if she's wrong and the virus hasn't run its course, or, you know, language and doesn't return, what happens then? That's the scary part of the story. And I think that's what we're kind of supposed to be left with. I mean, I don't think Butler wants us to be completely bummed out, just mostly bummed out. I think that we are supposed to feel Rye's hope and optimism as well. But we need to tread carefully because there's no guarantee that the language will return. So, geez, some definitely some optimism, but also still a very real possibility of a very bleak future for Rye and these kids. I think it's somewhat appropriate to talk about this story right now. Because we are living in a time when our spoken language has not been taken from us, our written language has not been taken from us, but yet our ability to communicate effectively and our ability to remain in control of our emotions when trying to communicate, we're struggling as a society. Not the world over. It seems to be a very American thing right now. But isn't it crazy that, we have a virus of our own that we're dealing with right now? And although our communication issues started long before that virus is still playing a very big part in perpetuating, continuing these struggles with communication. And I just wonder what is going to happen, right? Just like I wonder what happens if the future is not as bright as Rye is starting to think it could be. I wonder about ours as well sometimes. So I hope you guys enjoyed it. For me, it's odd because it's the least weird out of all the stories that we've read, but yet at the same time, it's the weirdest. I don't know. But I just think in this case, I think the themes are important in all the other stories we read, but in this one, I feel like the story really is just a vehicle to get us to thinking about communication and language. So I hope you guys enjoyed it. If you have any additional questions or want to discuss something else about the story, please let me know. Otherwise, you guys are free to move on to the next thing.